At first glance, the decision made sense. A single aircraft breaking away from a formation and diving into cloud cover was rarely a sign of weakness. In the air, nothing was ever that simple. For experienced fighter pilots, that movement carried a familiar meaning. It suggested coordination, timing, a setup that had been seen before. A lone aircraft dropping away often wasn't fleeing the fight. It was shaping it. Veteran pilots had learned to distrust isolation. Anything that looked too expo usually was, especially at altitude, where energy, speed, and position mattered more than numbers. Chasing downward carried risks. Altitude was life. Give it up too early, and you traded control for uncertainty. Staying high wasn't hesitation. It was discipline. From above, formations could see more, react faster, and choose when to commit. Diving after every isolated contact was how pilots were drawn out of position, how formations were stretched, split, and dismantled piece by piece. And this tactic had worked. Repeatedly, aircraft would peel off, draw attention, and force fighters into low-energy fights where support vanished and options narrowed. Those who stayed high survived longer. Those who chased too eagerly often didn't. So when one aircraft dropped away into the clouds, the signal was familiar, almost routine. It fit the pattern. Cloud cover below meant uncertainty, poor visibility, limited escape routes. If it was bait, diving would give the trap exactly what it needed. Separation. If it wasn't, the aircraft would eventually reappear, climbing back up, low on energy and exposed. Either way, patience seemed safer than pursuit. The formation held its altitude. Spacing stayed tight. Angles remained controlled. From their perspective, nothing urgent had happened. Nothing that demanded an immediate response. They weren't ignoring a threat. They were managing one. And in air combat, management often mattered more than aggression. Experience reinforced that belief. Past success made the decision feel proven, not risky. The sky above remained theirs. The aircraft below appeared committed to leaving it. Everything about the situation suggested restraint. Everything except one detail that hadn't yet revealed itself. And because that detail didn't look dangerous, because it didn't break any known pattern, it was dismissed. Not as a mistake, not as carelessness, but as a reasonable judgment made in a familiar moment. For a short time, everything still looked normal. The aircraft below stayed hidden by cloud. No sudden climb. No second contact appearing above or behind the formation. That absence was the first deviation. Normally, bait revealed itself quickly. Either the decoy pulled fighters down, or the real threat appeared elsewhere, forcing a reaction. Here, neither happened. Seconds passed. Then more. From above, the formation continued to wait for the pattern to complete itself. It always did. But this time the sky stayed quiet. No movement above their altitude. No pressure from the flanks. No sign that the aircraft below was coordinating with anything else. The clouds remained closed. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it introduced uncertainty. A decoy that didn't trigger a response wasn't doing its job. A lure that didn't lead anywhere wasn't a lure at all. Still, nothing obvious felt wrong. From their position, diving blindly into cloud cover carried its own danger. Visibility would collapse. Energy would bleed away. Formation integrity would be compromised. And for what? There was still no confirmed threat. So they held. But now, they were no longer waiting for the trap. They were waiting for confirmation that there was no trap. That distinction mattered. The longer the aircraft below failed to reappear, the more the situation drifted away from expectation. In air combat, timing was information. Delays meant intent. Yet intent was still unclear. Was the aircraft damaged? Was it disengaging entirely? Was it stalling out of the fight? All of those explanations were plausible. All of them fit the visual picture. And because they fit, they were accepted. But beneath that logic sat a growing imbalance. Time was being spent. Altitude was being preserved. Yet awareness was narrowing. The formation was focused on what might appear above them, not on what might already be moving below. The decision to wait had not changed, but the conditions around that decision had. And that shift went unnoticed, because nothing dramatic had happened. No sudden threat had emerged. No mistake had announced itself. The picture still looked stable. It just wasn't complete anymore. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through absence. There was still no second aircraft. No sudden movement above the formation. No coordinated response revealing itself from the clouds. The pattern they were waiting for never completed. At first, that was dismissed as delay. Then as coincidence. Then as bad visibility. But gradually, another explanation began to surface. One that didn't fit what they were used to seeing. The aircraft below wasn't setting anything up. It wasn't pulling attention. It wasn't waiting for support. It wasn't trying to split the formation. It was simply gone. Not retreating in panic. Not stalling out of the fight. Gone with intent. That was the first shock. Because in air combat, intention mattered more than motion. And intention was now pointing in the wrong direction. The formation hadn't been drawn into a trap. It had been removed from relevance. Time, which had once worked in their favor, had shifted sides. Every second spent waiting had allowed the aircraft below to reposition. To choose altitude, speed, and direction without interference. That wasn't how decoys behaved. Decoys demanded attention. They created urgency. They forced reactions. This aircraft had done the opposite. And that was when the mistake became visible. Not as an error in action, but as an error in reading the situation. They had been watching the wrong space. The sky above them was empty because nothing was coming from there. The danger wasn't forming overhead. It was forming out of sight. By the time that understanding took hold, the option to correct it was already shrinking. Diving now meant chasing timing they no longer controlled. Staying high meant conceding space that had already been taken. For the first time, neither choice felt right. That moment, when familiar logic stopped producing safe outcomes, was the real beginning of the fight. Not when weapons were fired, not when aircraft were damaged, but when the formation realized that the aircraft they had dismissed had never been bait at all. It had been repositioning the entire battle, and they had allowed it to happen. Once the misread became clear, the situation began to change rapidly. Not because of what the aircraft below did, but because of what the formation above was now forced to do. Control had shifted. Altitude, which moments earlier had felt secure, was no longer an advantage. It had become a debt. Every second spent high meant conceding space elsewhere. Every second spent deciding meant falling further behind the timing of the fight. The formation reacted. Not all at once, but unevenly. One aircraft peeled off first, diving to recover position. Another followed, adjusting speed and angle to compensate. Spacing tightened, then loosened. What had been a single, coherent shape in the sky began to stretch. That stretch was the beginning of collapse. Because formations don't fail when they are attacked. They fail when they are forced to correct themselves. The act of fixing one problem created another. Diving regained contact, but bled energy. Climbing restored separation, but surrendered timing. Staying together preserved mutual cover, but exposed blind spots. Every choice came with a cost, and the costs were accumulating faster than they could be paid. The aircraft below didn't need to act aggressively. It didn't need to force a mistake. The mistake was already unfolding. As the formation adjusted, attention narrowed. Pilots focused on regaining what had been lost. Altitude, spacing, awareness. In doing so, they stopped seeing the fight as a whole. The sky fractured. Instead of one engagement, there were now several, each occurring at different heights, with different speeds, and different levels of risk. That fragmentation was critical, because once a formation stops sharing the same fight, it stops being a formation at all. Communication shortened. Movements became reactive. No one was setting the pace anymore. They were following it. The aircraft that had been dismissed earlier now dictated where pressure appeared, not by attacking directly, but by being where it shouldn't have been, at moments when no one expected it. Every adjustment made to counter that presence pulled the formation further out of balance. This was the true chain reaction, not a series of dramatic errors, but a sequence of reasonable corrections that collectively led in the wrong direction. By the time the pattern became obvious, the formation was no longer fighting a battle. It was managing consequences. The original mistake had, what began as a single misread, had become a structural failure, and there was no longer a way to reverse it, only ways to endure it. The response was immediate. Once the shift became undeniable, the formation tried to reclaim control, not through aggression, but through discipline. Altitude was traded deliberately. Angles were corrected. Spacing was tightened to restore mutual cover. Nothing about the response was reckless. This was textbook recovery. The idea was simple. Compress the formation, reduce exposure, and deny the aircraft below the freedom it had been given. If timing had been lost, it could be rebuilt. If position had slipped, it could be contested again. At least in theory. But theory assumed one thing that no longer existed: time. Every corrective move demanded a sacrifice. Diving regained contact, but drained energy that could not be recovered quickly. Climbing restored separation, but conceded initiative to an opponent already positioned to exploit it. Staying close preserved defensive overlap, but made the formation predictable. The very measures meant to stabilize the fight began to harden it. Flexibility disappeared. What had once been a dynamic system became rigid. The formation was reacting correctly, just too late. That delay changed everything. The aircraft they were now trying to counter had already completed its repositioning. It no longer needed surprise. It already had angles. Every attempt to contain it revealed another weakness. Blind spots shifted. Cover thinned. Timing slipped further. The pilots felt it. Not panic, but pressure. The sense that each correction fixed one problem, only by exposing another. This wasn't failure through incompetence. It was failure through sequence. The wrong decision had not been made here. It had been made earlier. What followed was simply its consequence. By the time the formation recognized that recovery itself was creating new vulnerabilities, the fight had crossed a threshold. They were no longer trying to win. They were trying to prevent the situation from worsening. And that distinction mattered, because once a battle reaches that point, every move becomes defensive. And defensive reactions, no matter how precise, cannot undo a mistake that has already reshaped the field. There were still aircraft in the air. Engines were running. Weapons were loaded. Pilots were alive and responding. But something essential had disappeared. There were no longer any good options. Every possible move now solved one problem by creating another. Climbing restored altitude, but cost speed. Diving regained speed, but surrendered separation. Holding formation preserved cover, but exposed the rear. Breaking away reduced exposure, but invited isolation. The fight had become a closed system. No decision improved the situation overall. Each merely shifted pressure from one place to another. That was the moment the battle crossed its point of no return. The earlier misread had compressed time. Decisions that once allowed reflection now demanded immediate response. Seconds mattered more than positioning. Instinct replaced planning. And under that pressure, even correct choices lost their power. The pilots understood this, not intellectually, not as hindsight, but as sensation. the feeling that the fight was now moving faster than they could shape it. They were no longer setting conditions. They were responding to them. By then the error was clear. The aircraft they had dismissed had not forced a mistake. It had revealed one. By waiting, the formation had allowed the fight to be defined elsewhere. And once defined, it could not be redefined. There was no maneuver left that could restore balance. No timing left to exploit. Only degrees of loss. At that point, the goal quietly changed. Victory faded as an objective. Survival took its place. The formation still moved, still reacted, still fought. But it no longer fought to win. It fought to endure. That was the true cost of the original decision. Not the damage that would follow, but the moment when the future of the fight stopped being negotiable. From that point on, the sky felt heavier. Not quieter, not calmer, just slower. The formation was still moving, but movement no longer carried purpose, only necessity. The objective had shifted without being spoken aloud. It was no longer about controlling the fight. It was about lasting through it. Pilots stopped searching for opportunity. They began watching for exits. Fuel levels mattered more than angles. Distance mattered more than advantage. Every maneuver was conservative. Every adjustment defensive. Nothing bold. Nothing decisive. The airspace itself had become predictable. Once a battle loses unpredictability, it stops being a contest. It becomes a countdown. The aircraft that had forced the initial error no longer needed to press aggressively. Time was already doing the work. Every second the formation remained engaged. Increased fatigue, reduced options, tightened margins. The pilots felt it in small ways. Longer glances at instruments, shorter radio calls, movements chosen for safety rather than effect. They were no longer shaping the fight. They were navigating its end. Attempts to disengage came cautiously. Cloud cover was used not as concealment, but as relief. Separation widened, then widened again. The sky that had once been shared now felt divided. Each aircraft occupied its own narrow slice of space, concerned less with coordination and more with survival. There was no collapse, no sudden rout, just a gradual thinning. The formation loosened not because it was attacked, but because it could no longer afford to stay tight. Mutual cover gave way to individual judgment. And individual judgment, under pressure, was never as strong as collective control. By the time disengagement became possible, the outcome no longer mattered. The fight had already resolved itself. Not in violence, not in spectacle, but in exhaustion. What remained was simply the act of leaving the sky, with as much intact as possible. That was the final phase of the battle. Not defeat in motion, but defeat in waiting. The fight didn't end with a single decisive moment. There was no final maneuver that changed everything. No dramatic reversal. No clear signal that marked the end. It ended the way many air battles did. By thinning out. One aircraft broke contact first, slipping away under cloud cover. Its engine still running. Its pilot choosing distance over risk. Another followed, damaged but controllable. No longer looking for position, only for a clear path home. Others stayed just long enough to ensure they weren't being followed, then turned away as well. The sky gradually emptied. What had once been a structured engagement became scattered motion. Isolated aircraft moving on separate trajectories, no longer connected by purpose. There was no pursuit, not because opportunity didn't exist, but because the cost of extending the fight now outweighed its value. The battle had already taken what it was going to take. When the last contact faded, the air didn't feel victorious. It felt vacant. Only later, after engines cooled and the adrenaline drained away, did the shape of the fight become clear. The outcome hadn't been decided by firepower or numbers. It hadn't been decided at the end at all. It had been decided much earlier, high above the clouds, when a single aircraft was dismissed and allowed to redefine the engagement. By the time the battle ended, that decision almost felt distant. The fight itself had simply followed the direction it had been given. In the end, the loss itself wasn't the most important part. Aircraft could be repaired. Formations could be rebuilt. Pilots would fly again. What couldn't be recovered was the moment that had been misread. Because the most dangerous mistakes in combat are rarely reckless. They don't feel impulsive. They don't feel careless. They feel reasonable. They are built from experience, from patterns that once worked, from decisions that have been rewarded before. That was the trap. The aircraft wasn't ignored because it looked harmless. It was ignored because it looked familiar. A known signal, a known behavior, a situation that seemed already understood. And that familiarity created certainty, where none should have existed. The error wasn't tactical. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't even situational. It was perceptual. The assumption that what had worked before would work again. Without question. This is why the mistake mattered more than the outcome. Because battles end, but habits remain. In the air, as in command rooms far from it, decisions are often shaped by expectation, long before they are shaped by evidence. A signal is recognized, a conclusion is drawn, and the opportunity to question it passes unnoticed. That aircraft was never meant to distract. It didn't need to. The distraction was already in place, inside the decision itself. By the time the error became visible, it no longer looked like a mistake. It looked like fate. But it was a reminder that the most decisive moments in combat often arrive quietly, without warning, without drama. They arrive when something familiar is mistaken for something harmless. And by the time that assumption is challenged, the fight has already been shaped, long before it is ever finished.